Look at the whiteboard. The discussion is about structure of simple, complex and compound sentence. These three types of sentences are also the essential part of our syllabus. But first of all, we must know the origin or sources of simple, complex and compound sentences. In what way you will be able to identify these three types of sentences. As a result, today I am going to discuss the structure of simple, complex and compound sentences. You can also learn it very easily by the identifying of clause. Clause means in Bengali, bakangsha. Clause. There are three types of clause in English. One is independent clause, another is dependent clause, and in the third part you will have to learn about coordinate clause. First of all, I am going to discuss the definition of independent clause. Definition of independent clause. Independent clause. The clause that expresses its meaning by itself without taking the help of other clauses or sentences, then it is called independent clause. The Bengali meaning of this independent clause is, that is why called. Now I am going to write down on the whiteboard the definition of independent clause. The clause that expresses its meaning, that expresses its meaning by without taking the help of other clause. That means the clause that expresses its meaning, that can express or reveal its meaning by itself, then it is called independent clause. Then it is called independent clause. Independent clause. As for example, I am a teacher. I am a teacher. You are my students. You are my students. An independent clause is also called a simple sentence. A simple sentence is always consisted of only an independent clause. So this is the real and authentic and perfect definition of independent clause. It will help you in the examination hall to identify the simple sentence. Now I am going to effect this definition, and in the next part I will discuss the characteristics or features and definition of dependent clause. This is the second discussion, second part of clause. In the next step, I am going to discuss the definition of dependent clause. Definition of dependent clause. Dependent clause. the clause which cannot express its meaning, cannot express its meaning by itself, That means the clause which expresses its meaning as the part of independent clause, which expresses its meaning by taking the help of other clause, by taking the help of other clause, then it is called dependent clause. Then it is called dependent clause. This is the proper definition of dependent clause. But if you want to identify the dependent clause in other way, you will have to memorize some definite words. As for example, the clause that is started with, the clause that is commenced or started by what, where, when, how, why, which, who, whom, so, that, as, if, because, unless, though, although, for, since. Now look at the beginning of the definition. The clause that is commenced or started by what, where, when, how, why, which, who, whom, so, that, as, if, because, unless, though, although, for, since. Then the clause is called dependent clause. Clause is called dependent clause. Dependent clause. As a teacher, it is my expectation from you, from my all students, that you will memorize all the definition and all the identifying words, so that you can very easily understand the definition of dependent clause. Now I am going to efface this definition and all these words so that I can write down the third part, that means coordinate clause. Coordinate clause is also started with conjunction like and, but, yet, or. The third discussion is coordinate clause. Coordinate clause. This is the third discussion. The clause that is commenced or started, that is started or commenced by and, but, yet, or. And, but, yet, or. Then It is called coordinate clause. It is called coordinate clause. Another remarkable point is that either or and neither nor. Either or and neither nor are also the two important characteristics or features of coordinate clause. Also, the characteristics or features of coordinate clause. These three types of clause will help you to identify the sentences, whether it is simple sentence or complex sentence or compound sentence. Now I will explain or illustrate all these clauses through the sentences chronologically and gradually and step by step. First of all, simple sentence will be discussed. Definition of simple sentence. Definition of simple sentence. Simple sentence. A simple sentence is also called an independent clause. A simple sentence is also called an independent clause. An independent clause. That means the sentence that contains only an independent clause is called a simple sentence. The sentence that contains or possesses an independent clause. Only an independent clause. An independent clause is called a simple sentence. Is called a simple sentence. Simple sentence. So, while you are going to transfer the simple sentence into complex or compound one, or in the reverse way, complex or compound sentence is going to be transferred into simple sentence, you will have to remember in mind this definition so that you can transfer it very easily and efficiently and perfectly. In the next step, in the second discussion, I am going to discuss the definition of complex sentence. The definition of complex sentence. Definition of complex sentence. The sentence that contains independent clause, and one or more dependent clauses. One or more dependent clauses. Dependent clauses, then it is called a simple sentence. It is called a simple sentence. Sorry, it is called a complex sentence. It is called a complex sentence. So the structure must be written in this way: a structure of complex sentence. Complex sentence. Independent clause with dependent clause. Independent clause plus dependent clause. Dependent clause. This is the structure of complex sentence. So, the example of complex sentence can be written in this way that I am going to write on this whiteboard. I will not go to college. Go to college as I am ill. So look at the entire sentence. This sentence contains two clauses. One is independent clause and other is dependent clause. I will not go to college. This part is definitely an independent clause. Independent clause. As I am ill. This is dependent clause. So this is dependent clause. So in total we may call it an example of complex sentence. Complex sentence. Now in the third discussion, in the third step, I am going to discuss the structure and example of compound sentence. Definition of compound sentence. Compound sentence. The sentence that contains or possesses independent clause, and coordinate clause. Coordinate clause. The sentence that contains or possesses independent clause and coordinate clause is called a compound sentence. Compound sentence. In the commencement or rudiment or starting of my class, I have already mentioned the features or characteristics of coordinate clause. And the features or characteristics of coordinate clause are and, but, yet, or. So, in the example of compound sentence, you will find such kind of characteristic. Example of compound sentence. Compound sentence. I am very ill today, yet I will go to college. I will go to college. Now look at the structure of the sentence. I am very ill today. This part indicates or implies independent clause. Independent clause. And yet I will go to college. This is the example of coordinate clause. Coordinate clause. So the entire sentence is written in the compound form. Now I think you have realized, you have understood all the parts of clause and in what way clauses are interconnected with the structure of simple, complex and compound sentences. If the simple sentence contains in spite of, then complex sentence must be started with though, and compound sentence will have to be written by adding but or yet. In the middle part. Now the example is that simple. In spite of his illness, he will go to college. In the next step, if you want to transfer it into complex sentence, you must use though. Though he is ill. He will go to college. He will go to college. Here the remarkable point is that noun must be transferred into adjective case, and such kind of possessive will have to be divided into two parts. One is subjective case and other is auxiliary verb. In the compound form, first of all you will have to divide the possessive case. He is ill, yet he will go to college. He will go to college. This type of transformation is included within your syllabus, and you will have to learn all these structures, but within a short span of time it is not possible for me to discuss all the parts in a single class. In my next classes, I will try my best to discuss all of the important chapters from simple, complex and compound sentences. The most important elements that must be learned by you, that must be memorized by you, so that you can transfer the simple, complex and compound sentences into other parts. First of all, important elements. Number 1, identifying three types of clause. Three types of clauses. 2, recognizing the sentences. The sentences. Number 3, changing of parts of speech. Changing of parts of speech. Parts of speech. And in the next part, possessive equal to subject plus verb. Subject plus auxiliary verb. In the next classes, all these parts will be discussed chronologically and gradually and step by step, so that you can understand all of the parts very easily. Goodbye.